This is this is Dan Laroche. He's the site supervisor at Fort George National Historic Board. Dan Laroche has been at Fort George since 1988 and has been a manager of Fort George for the past 20 years. He has done years of research on Fort George and was one of the authors of the new publication, Fort George, The History. Dan will tell the story of the Battle of Fort George using original artifacts from the War of 1812. Those are on the page. I understand we'll have the opportunity to see and in some cases get our hands on some of these artifacts, some of which have never been seen publicly. Please welcome Dan to our PROBUS meeting.
Great, thank you. As you mentioned, my name is Dan Laroche. I'm the managing supervisor at Fort George. And I thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you this morning. I am going to talk just really about the War of 1812 as it pertains to the Battle of Fort George, which is in the middle of the war in May of 1813. I am not, by any stretch of the imagination, going to get into the entirety of the war. I will not do that to you folks today. It would take days, so we're going to try. I'm going to try my best to stay as focused as I can on really the one major engagement that certainly obviously impacted the site that I work for. Before I get really any further, I do want to acknowledge the folks that were here certainly well before any of us Europeans arrived here, and also heavily involved as allies during the War of 1812. And specifically, well, actually in this area as well, and certainly right along the mouth of the Niagara River, which is where Fort George is located. The indigenous that were called those areas home, or the traditional lands, were both the Haudenosaunee as well as the Anishinaabe. Now, I know when I was growing up that those are not the names that I certainly knew. So this is something that certainly for me, I had to sort of take a look at, okay, what are we talking about? And
Jim, excuse me, leave them on, no PowerPoint. Oh, thank you.
yeah, my PowerPoint's right here.
One more.
And some of them emphasis on point. Great, thanks. So Haudenosaunee is really referring to the Iroquois, or the Six Nations. And so nations such as the Mohawk, the Seneca, the Tuscarora, Cayugas, etc. Those are the Haudenosaunee. Now for the Anishinaabe, we are really referring to, we're talking about the Algonquins, Mississaugas, Ottawas, Chippewas, names that we're all familiar, certainly in Ontario, are really talking about the Anishinaabe. And if we want to have a very specific link, in particular, with one of the Anishinaabe nations to Fort George, the very property that Fort George is on, and in fact, from the mouth of the river going 4 miles inland from Lake Ontario to Lake Erie, was purchased from the Mississauga nations in 1781. So the very property that we are on, in fact, the very property that the Battle of Fort George was fought on, was ceded by purchase in that particular year, 1781. So a lot of the reasons that the indigenous were interested, particularly in the Niagara, or the town of Niagara-on-the-Lake, as we know it today. Never mind. The reasons why they were interested in the area is very much the same reasons that the Europeans were interested in the area, and its transportation. You think of before really road systems that were decent, or certainly pre-railways, pre-canals, waterways were absolutely everything. If you think of a major transportation route that essentially was the St. Lawrence Seaway a couple hundred years ago, the Niagara River is part of that. I do recognize that at some point Niagara Falls does become challenged, but you simply portage around it. That's where Queenston was important. That's you, unless you're nuts, you don't go any further than Queenston. Even today, unless you're the jet boat, you stop at Queenston, you portage around. So for those of you familiar with the area, Portage Road went from Queenston to Chippewa. So you portaged around the falls and then loaded onto a separate fleet. Continue on the way. Really, once you get to the rest of the upper lakes and the river system, the Niagara River, or the Seaway of the period, is the route to the middle of the continent. There are really two major transportation routes a couple hundred years ago. One in the United States, that's the Mississippi, and then up here in British North America, actually also serving the United States, is essentially the St. Lawrence Seaway. So from now a strategic perspective, when we're getting into now conflict between Great Britain and the United States, the War of 1812, waterways were everything. Warfare, ultimately, bring it down to, particularly in North America, is a fairly simple idea. Own the waterways, you will own your end. It's just a matter of time. And so that makes then, of course, the whole Niagara area, or anywhere along the Niagara River, or anywhere along any waterway, incredibly important. Because it's a pretty simple fact. If you can capture particularly the Niagara area, guaranteed you'll make life very exciting for your enemy in very short order if you now cut off their avenue of supply. And so that's the reason why the Niagara area was incredibly important. Every year of the war, the Americans' strategy overall for taking of Canada was strangely the same every year, despite whether they did okay or didn't do okay. It's really, the strategy was sound. It wasn't, it's just sometimes the actual, what they were doing didn't always work out terribly well for them. And it was always a three-pronged approach. So you're looking at out on the Western Theater, the Detroit Theater area, so sort of that area, Niagara, so this area, and then Montreal. That's the three spots. Every year of the war, they made attempts at those spots. That was the overall strategy. Now, as I mentioned, I'm going to limit myself to really the Niagara part of it for 1813. And the American strategy for the Niagara campaign for 1813 was pretty simple. Go to York, attack York, and York we had facilities there, particularly a major naval facility. So there, they were to raid York, and a raid is in, wreck stuff, leave. Not attempt. The idea is not to hold on the ground. It's just to make life exciting for your enemy. So they did that and then after raiding York, take Fort George, and then use that as the foothold with which to take the rest of the province of Upper Canada. So that was the strategy. So they started in April 27th, nice, very successful amphibious assault on York. Burnt a few public buildings, certainly, and destroyed an awful lot of the naval stores that were there for capture. And then sailed across Lake Ontario and encamped themselves in behind Fort Niagara. And for the next month, we are watching them. And it's, I thought I had it out, and I apologize. The distance between Fort George and the United States is 1,000 yards. You can actually see quite easily. With the right weather conditions, you could yell at somebody across the river. It's only about 600 or so 100 yards wide at that point. So we are literally, you can watch the Americans gather more troops, starting to build artillery batteries. They're gathering landing craft as they're floating right by us. We can certainly see the fact that their flotilla of 14 relatively large, at least for the Great Lakes anyways, their naval flotilla is also gathering there as well. At this particular point in time, I guess it's important to point out that the Americans had ascendancy in the area, certainly the Niagara area of the Great Lakes. So this is one of the reasons why we aren't able to do much about it. We also are watching all of this, and there's not a lot we can do about it either. And it comes down to the one simple fact that while this is going on, we are also fighting a much bigger problem back home in Europe, Napoleon. So our ability to send resources over here to North America to help with this is virtually impossible. This is a sideshow. That's really what this is. And so, literally, we're watching all of this go on. One of my favorite quotes from this period comes from the gentleman who was in charge of Fort George. His name was Brigadier John Vincent, and he was writing a report to his boss just less than a week before the actual battle of Fort George, and he's writing to his boss in Quebec, giving him a little sort of idea of what's happening in Niagara. And I love it because it's such a great example of that typical British understatement of the situation that's happening in his area under his command. And he wrote, with the exception of an almost constant and ostentatious parade of troops, artillery, and boats upon the opposite shore, nothing else deserving of notice is happening along this frontier. He mentioned everything that I just said, and he also said the obvious intention of the enemy will be invasion. And of course, he's correct. And so, a couple days after, he wrote that on May 19th, and then the first part of the battle, I guess you could call it part one or the prelude, was to bombard the fort. Obviously, that was obvious to us. They constructed 5 artillery batteries just for this occasion. So it was incredibly obvious that they were going to attempt to destroy the fort. And they did. Very early in the morning, on the 25th of May, the guns at Fort Niagara and 5 detached batteries of artillery opened up. We're talking well over 30 guns, land-based, and the Navy, I think by all accounts, also some of them joined in on the fun as well. So we're talking at least 40 plus guns opened up on Fort George, firing a particularly simple projectile. It's a solid iron ball, and depending on the gun, it weighs 9, 12, 18, 24 pounds. But they heated them up in a furnace. It's like a giant wood stove on wheels, but that's the best description I can think of. And it's called a hot shot furnace, and they heated these things up red hot and then fired them. So it's now incendiary. So as they come crashing into pretty much the entirely exclusively wooden garrison of Fort George, they did damage, but more importantly, they set everything on fire. Now, before I go any further, see if I can actually pick this up. This is an example. It could be original, it could be a reproduction, and there are some markings on them that make me suspect that it is a casting, which would make it then a reproduction, but that's a 24-pounder. So it means it weighs 24 pounds. Now you got to imagine this, it leaves the barrel at roughly 1,000 feet per second. By the time it came to Fort George, it's traveling roughly 600 feet per second. That'll redecorate your home quite nicely. There's no doubt about that. It's kinetic and it would do substantial damage. But again, imagine if that's been heated up red hot while it's doing damage, more importantly, it's setting everything on fire. And after an 8-hour barrage of these things, so there's a variety of calibers. Every single wooden structure inside of Fort George burnt to the ground. And by all accounts, it includes the fence that surrounds it, so the palisade as well. So Fort George really minus one building, and I always find it's a great piece of iron. The one building that survived, and we still have it today in the reconstructed museum that's open to the public, is our powder magazine. The one building that housed all of your explosives is the only building that survived. Well, by all accounts, it was a massive artillery compartment. That's because it was well protected, built properly, and also was protected by a wall. But anyways, save that building, everything else that exists there today ceased to exist. So that's all very well and good. From a military perspective, it's an inconvenience. It is not at all the end of the world. What is an actual successful invasion and taking the building. That's part number 2. And this is now the invasion, which happened 2 days later. This is truly where the Navy came into play. So 14 ships lined up. They took out a couple of our shore artillery batteries, and then they lined up, basically covering the landing. So there was roughly 150 landing craft, which are a large rowboat that fits 30 to 50 guys, and these ships are in behind. These aren't the massive ships of the line we see in movies that have 80, 90 guns. But still, even if they had 6 a dozen guns, you line them up times 14, that's a pretty substantial artillery battery. They're firing over top of the landing craft as they're going in. If you think of D-Day, that is the exact same tactic, different technology, but it's the same thing. So, and they're firing again, large shot like this, but they're also firing anti-personnel. And I'll get into that in just a second. Once they hit the beach, then they would stop firing. And then there happens to be a bit of an embankment where they landed. And if you're familiar with Niagara-on-the-Lake as well, the majority of the landing zone was between 1 Mile Creek and 2 Mile Creek. But you can extend elements of the valley land really all the way from 4 Mile Creek along the shore right up to where Fort Mississauga is today. It wasn't there at that point, but there was a lighthouse that was there. Everywhere in between those 4 miles was essentially active, but the primary landing between 1 and 2 Mile Creeks. So if we think of what's there today, the D&D property where the rifle range used to be, that's ground zero. You go on the other side of their fence, the Chautauqua area in Niagara-on-the-Lake, that's ground zero. That is principally where most of the actual battle happened. So we had a small number of us, roughly 630 of us were there along the shores. We had to divide ourselves into three, and this is smart, Vincent did this, because we know the Americans have to come, but there's only one way you can get to us, and that's by water. And there we go. And that's either along the riverside, the lake shore, or both. And so you divide into three, one to keep an eye on the river, one to keep an eye on the lake, and then keep one back and reserve to help the other when necessary. And so the Americans didn't actually end up attacking along the river, although they had a few troops that were going up it, and with the intent of crossing, that never happened. So that kept a third of us occupied, keeping an eye on those guys, while the actual main invading force along the shores of Lake Ontario. Once they hit the beach, they had a bit of an embankment. It's roughly the height actually of the ceiling in here, so it's not huge. And a couple of times they scrambled up that, and that's where we were waiting for them, and literally pushed them back down at the point of bayonet. Those that were involved in that initial pushing back of the Americans were small number of regulars. The Lincoln Militia were there as well. Another group was the Colored Corps, so a group of ex-slaves and also just free men of African descent were there as well, and I call the initial greeting of the Americans, and the indigenous were there as well. So I've got a couple of things here. So I mentioned the point of bayonet, so we'll start with that. This is an original bayonet, and it is just over 16 inches in length. They're nasty, three-sided, so it's not sharp. It's meant to, I won't get into the gruesome details, it's meant for poking, that's really what it's for. And this actually is stamped the 8th Regiment Foot, and the 8th were actually involved in all elements of the battle along the lakeshore, and were by far the regiment that took the most casualties. These guys took it. So while I cannot say with certainty which troop that was issued to, there is a very good chance that that particular bayonet was actually at the conflict. So for us, and for me particularly, that's a nice artifact to have. I mentioned the indigenous, and I brought a couple of original, what are called pipe axes or pipe tomahawks. That's what I've got here. The indigenous fought with a number of different weaponry. It was essentially a combination of both traditional weapons as well as European weapons. So they did carry firearms, but they also carried things like this. This was not, as we tend to see, strangely enough, this is really popular in bars in the United States where you throw these things at. They didn't typically throw them. It was usually very much hand to hand. So it was, nasty piece of work. But as an additional weapon, they carried these knives and certainly clubs as well as actual firearms. Well, this one is original. We have no idea where it came from. So it certainly, I don't think, has its provenance with the Niagara area necessarily, but it is certainly original to the time period and a good example of one that would be carried by a warrior. This one, again, we don't know where from. It is original, but more likely something that was carried by warrior chiefs. Both well. I mentioned earlier, I forgot this, of course, I did mention that each time, the Americans, as they're scrambling up this and we're beating them back, you have to imagine this. Every time we push them back down onto the beach, those ships would open up again, firing not only the solid shot, but also firing canister shot. And canister is really anti-personnel, it's nasty stuff. So literally, a canister shot is a tin can, and this is original. This is actually naval, not from the Niagara area. Actually, it was found in the dockyard area of Amherstburg and then brought up and restored. So this obviously then for sure is naval. But to confirm that with, they only had 9 balls. Naval tended to fire only 9 balls, whereas land tended to fire slightly smaller balls, and there are 15 in this. I believe this is an 18-pounder version. It might be a 24, but anyways, heavy canister. So you have 9 of these balls on the inside of this. When it gets fired, that splits apart the second it leaves the barrel, and then you can imagine certainly being in front of that. It's essentially a shotgun writ large. And they fire that at our line. And by a strange coincidence of geography, Fort Niagara could also see down the line of the shoreline and also see the battlefield. So they would open up as well. And so we're running for cover as fast as we possibly can. And so 3 times, as I mentioned, the Americans, we beat back. But on the 4th time, it's just numbers of firepower that's really winning. They're able to get themselves onto the shore proper. And this is when that traditional European style line versus line battle took place. And it was short and it was nasty and at very close quarters. The best description I've run across comes from an American. He was a brigadier general. He was right in the thick of it. He was right on the beach that morning, Brigadier General Boyd. And he wrote in this little quote, I love it because it's short, mostly. And he said the battle was for 15 minutes, the 2 sides exchanged a rapid and destructive fire at a distance of only 6 to 10 yards. So even with exaggeration, not all the battle was fought at that close quarters. This was, by all accounts, an absolutely horrendous battle. They talk about it afterwards, onlookers or observers talk about lines of troops, almost the feet on the ground, falling, almost touching each other. It was fought in that close of quarters. So pretty nasty stuff. I'm going to point out a couple of things. So what they're firing at each other at that point. This is an original musket ball, and everybody will have a chance to come up afterwards. Anything that you basically touch it, it's fine. I don't recommend licking it, but you're certainly allowed to touch it. The British fired a 75 caliber ball, or sorry, 75 caliber weapon. That's the musket, of which I've got an original here. But the ball that they were firing was actually 69 or .692. Soft lead. It tends to pancake upon hitting anything solid. I'll leave it there. So the Americans had slightly different projectiles that they were firing. They were working with a 68 caliber musket, Springfield, and that is a 62 caliber ball, so a little bit smaller. And what they did to help make up for the lack of accuracy is they added 3 little buck into it. So these were called buck and ball. We found this really quite unsporting. However, it does increase your chances of hitting something. No matter what, you get hit by any of this stuff. It's definitely going to wreck your day. There's no doubt about that. So at that battlefield, we ended up, the full amount of troops that we ended up there were just over 600. And after this brief firefight, we broke. Every senior grade officer that was there was injured at this point, and we broke. And then from there on, it was really fighting or retiring, really through the town of Niagara. And the Americans, as they're starting to land more and more troops, we have our artillery out there as well, trying to hold back the column, and that's helping hold back the American main force. And also, they have a column going along the lakeshore heading towards Townsend, going up the river, so heading south, and another column going in the other direction, which would then mean they eventually, that's like a pincer move, and eventually either outflank us on both sides or completely surround us. And so, again, as I mentioned, what's helping hold back that main column is the artillery. And field artillery also fired canister shot, much smaller than this. But here's an example. The typical field gun for the British, for the regular Royal Artillery, is firing, 6-pounder is a standard gun, and this actually is from canister shot, from a 6-pounder. All of the ammunition that I'm showing you was found in the vicinity of Fort George. So it's a stretch to say I know these were at the battle. I don't. What I can certainly say for any of the ammunition I showed you before, the musket anyways, they're intact. They're not, they've never been fired. As soon as you hit anything, they tend to warp a little bit. So any of these things, but they all, again, were found within the vicinity of Fort George. Okay, what else do I have here? So again, when it was that artillery holding back, they certainly would have been firing, certainly canister shot again. There are a lot more than just 9 or 15 of those within you're looking at numbers of 20 plus. So it's a pretty big spread that happens. So wreaking absolute havoc on the infantry. Now, at this point, as I said, we're firing retiring action through the town of Niagara. And once we realize that the Americans are setting up that pincer movement, at that point, Vincent gave the orders to retire. So off we go and we retire. We don't retreat, we retire. Through the town of Niagara, gathered any remaining troops that we had up the Niagara River, followed the escarpment, and eventually ended up all the way back at Burlington Bay. thus ended the Battle of Fort George. And that left now, once they were gone, the Americans then occupied the area, and that included where we are right now for a brief period of time. This was all U.S. occupied territory, so for a brief period of time, these certainly Fort George and the immediate environs were U.S. soil, and very clear to state that way. So there's a couple of other items I want to make sure that I show you. So we talked about the canister shot. I do have a couple, and I can't do two things at once because I do have to hold on to the microphone. This is an original musket, so this is a standard India pattern musket, and this is exactly what all of the regular British forces would have been carried, and the militia might have had some as well, although they might have had some of them a little slightly older version of it, but it looks virtually identical to that. So that is a smoothbore weapon. I mentioned earlier that's a 75 caliber barrel, fires a 69 caliber ball, and so that's what makes it a very fast loading weapon. Believe it or not, fast loading weapons 2 years ago means you can fire 4 shots a minute, and that's out of the smoothbore. And the reason is because that ball is smaller and it's a smoothbore. There's no rifling, so that's a nice thing, is you can load quickly. But the reverse, the problem with that is the fact because it can go down easily, it means it has the opportunity to rattle on its way out. So the ball can go in a whole number of different directions, making it pretty inaccurate. Anything beyond 75 yards, you're really not going to be able to get aimed at it anyways. And so the reason why they're firing or fighting in such large groups is to make up for the technologies of the day. So you've got a weapon that is incredibly inaccurate, but also has up to a 30%, actually beyond that, once you get going, it's got a 30% misfire rate. So to make up for these issues, you're firing large groups. So if I'm a lone musketman aiming down, say 50 yards in that direction, I might hit my target. But if I've got a small group of my friends, we all point in the general vicinity of our target and fire at the same time, called a volley fire. The odds are one of us will hit the target. And that's essentially, you want to break down linear tactics into one sentence. That was it. There were accurate weapons, rifles. Rifles have rifling, which is a series of grooves, and for that, the projectile has to fit extremely tightly in order for it to be able to follow those grooves out, and then it's incredibly accurate. It leaves the barrel, again, roughly the same speed, but it's going to go roughly 250, 300 yards, and actually it's accurate to roughly a couple hundred yards. This is an example of a rifle. It's a shortened version, so it's the carbine version of the Baker rifle, which is the standard British rifle. The disadvantages of the rifle is it takes forever to load. Because it's so tight, you have to ram this thing down, and it takes quite a while. So you might be able to load this thing up in 20, 30 seconds, the first shot, but that's going to slow down considerably. And so that you use these in conjunction with your regular forces. Because in most cases, I can take a shot with this, but there's probably 3 or 4 rounds coming at me from that army, that walls of lead coming at me before I have a chance to load this up. So these were used sort of sparingly by light infantry troops that were sort of your skirmishers ahead of the line or off on your flanks, taking out officers. This one, also original, and it's stamped for the 19th Light Dragoons. Not at the Battle of Fort George, but we're certainly in the area of the aftermath of the Battle of Fort George. And the 19th Light Dragoons were the only British regular cavalry unit that ever got involved in this war, certainly in this province. And these guys were basically out hunting and trying to push the Americans back. And with all the other troops, ultimately were successful in having the Americans, because they followed us all the way out towards Burlington, the Battle of Stony Creek ensued. But these guys were involved in that, trying to help force them up and force these guys back here. So there's a couple there. Also involved in the Battle of Fort George, as I mentioned, the local militia units. So the Lincoln militia, there are 5 of them. The 1st and the 4th were stationed at Fort George, and this is an original belt plate. So you have shoulder belts. One holds your bayonet, one holds your cartridge box, and what holds your bayonet belt together is the belt plate, and every regiment, including the regulars, would have one. And on it is stamped the 4th Lincoln Regiment. So for us, this was at Fort George. Maybe not the battle, but certainly on site. So that's a pretty special artifact for us. Now I mentioned officers, certainly certainly senior officer injured at the Battle of Fort George when we broke. This is an original portrait, and it's actually painted on ivory and then framed in wood, and it is a Major Edward Cobb. This portrait was done prior to the war. He was a junior officer in this, but he was actually injured at the Battle of Fort George, and the poor fellow died 5 months later. So certainly probably not a very pleasant way to go, but he was definitely at the battle, at the landing zone, and was really mortally wounded there. So for us to have actual paintings of individuals that were not only in Fort George, but also be at the battle, for us is pretty special. Although certainly not at the battle itself. This is an original, roughly 1804, maybe not much later, 1806, but anyways, original map of Fort George. And so for us, again, this is a pretty special piece to have. And it's things like this that certainly now, well over 80 years after the reconstruction, really help confirm for us what the fort actually looked like. And there's always question marks when you have a reconstruction. But anyways, it's a lovely little piece for us to have. And one couple things I forgot to mention earlier, or a couple of artifacts to point out, is in the direct aftermath of burning of the fort, so that bombardment, burning of every wooden building. What we found, this would have been back in 2010, roughly give or take a year or two. We had an archaeology team had come through because we were repairing our fence line on some houses. And that's a big project. And obviously, anytime we have to do any kind of digging, we are required to bring in archaeologists. And what they found out where our octagonal blockhouse is, that's at the back of the fort, was a cache of hundreds of artillery guns. They were deposited when the building burnt on May 25th. So basically 2 centuries later, our archaeologists found them in the spot that they were deposited on that day. So these are all definitely were at Fort George, and the Royal Artillery obviously was stationed at Fort George alongside the infantry. So those are original funds and original to the site, obviously. So that is all the artifacts that I have. I can certainly take questions in a couple of seconds, or maybe give you, I guess, why do we talk about this, and why is the War of 1812, the battle, whatever, to me important, sir?
Now that you're not, he goes, if I get you to stand by the.
Stand back here.
View of the laptop camera, the people on Zoom go right behind the laptop. So that.
Oh, behind, okay.
Yeah, and I'm gonna go on, sorry, I'm just gonna unpin this image. So if I can remember how, remove pin.
Yeah, I'm the wrong person to ask.
There you go.
Okay.
The few people left on Zoom may hear you better now. Thanks.
Good morning.
Yeah, there.
No, I was just like, I can actually see them as well, so we're just waving to each other here. To me, the so what is, why is the War of 1812? And to me, why is it important to all Canadians? And it doesn't matter to me where you're living in the country. It could be out in Vancouver. None of the action happened there. All of the war was fought really Windsor and East and in elements of southern Quebec. Not really anything happened really substantially in the Maritimes. So why is it important to everybody? And to me, it comes down to this. Had things gone differently in the conflict, the country that we know of as Canada today very simply might not exist. So for me, as a proud Canadian, I'm pretty happy with the outcome, the way it came out. The other element is to also make sure that we are remembering or commemorating those that were involved in the fighting. And there were really 3 groups that were involved. You take away, not all of them were involved in the same number of engagements or the same number of members of each of these groups were, or took the same number of casualties. It doesn't matter. We take away any one of these groups, and at the very least, this province, I can guarantee you, would have fallen. That's the British regular forces, the local militias, and of course the Indigenous. Take away any one of those, and this province certainly would have fallen. And the other element that we need to, I think, to remember and commemorate is the fact that the British regulars, the local militias, and the Indigenous all sacrificed thousands of lives defending what is now Canada. That, to me, is the point. So I'll leave it there. Any questions at all? Sir?
Hang on, let me get Mike too. So maybe the Zoom folks will hear your question, maybe not.
Good morning, and thank you. That's been wonderful so far. Just a question, Fort Niagara on the other side, I presume, also does all this archaeological work. They have their own museums. Do you share stuff back and forth with them, perhaps the stories or even the artifacts?
Okay, there's an interesting can of worms you open, but it's mostly just in my head. But we do share in commemoration, as in we do work together for events. So no doubt about that. In fact, we've helped with them for even outside of the War of 1812 time period. We were heavily involved in their commemorating the 250th of Fort Niagara a number of years ago. Basically, they called up and asked if we could fire artillery for an hour at them. And of course, we obliged happily. And yes, they've every year, actually, every time we have a major special event, there's always been a contingent of them that come over, and the same thing, we go over to help them with their One War of 1812 event that they do, which is typically on Labor Day weekend. So there is a very close relationship, much better than it was, let's say, during the war. Perhaps it's on par with what it was like before the War of 1812. But we do get along quite well. Artifact wise, no, we don't share, although it'd be fun to go ask them. I'd like to have our flag back. Lovely flag that it's the flag that we took when we captured Fort Niagara, which was later on. At the end of the American occupation, we then took Fort Niagara in a surprise night attack, and one of the prizes of war was the garrison flag, and they purchased it it's probably a couple of decades ago now, from the Drummond family, actually back in Europe or back in England, and it's now on display there. So if you ever have a chance to go there, I recommend seeing that. That is a flag that we captured. I'd love to have that at Fort George. And I do bring that up with...
That's the game of capture the flag.
I like it. I like it. I remind Jerry Brubaker of this quite a bit. So anyways, no, we do get along quite well with those guys. So.
How does the Queenston Heights area fit into the chronology of all this?
Okay, so as I mentioned, the American strategy every year, the war included Niagara. So therefore, there was a major attempt at the Niagara area every year of the war, 12, 13, and 14. I just talked about the 13 attempt, which is the Battle of Fort George, which, although initially successful, ultimately ended in their having to abandon their position in the Niagara area. The first attempt at Niagara was the Battle of Queenston Heights. So that's where that comes in. The death of Major General Isaac Brock was also part of that. And that was a total and utter defeat of the Americans. And we ended up capturing roughly 900 of them on that particular occasion. But the tides would change a little bit as the war went on. So yeah, and then the taking of Fort Erie, and then a whole last campaign in 1814, which included the Battle of Chippewa, Lundy's Lane, all of that was all part of that, the Siege of Fort Erie, which was the bloodiest part of the war anywhere, was that last little bit. But most of that took place upper Niagara River.
When you mentioned local militia, these are is this the beginnings of the Canadian Army? I mean, are these local white settlers who came from not just Britain but other countries in Europe?
Correct.
And what was the relationship between them and the British?
Okay. That could be a loaded question.
By the way, the questioner happens to be born in the UK, as you could probably tell. So
yeah.
Go ahead and just don't worry about that while you answer.
Understood. No.
He doesn't own a gun.
So the first part of your question, yes, this is the local citizenry and primarily white. There was a all black, as I mentioned earlier, militia unit that was formed in the town of Niagara, and that was the Colored Corps, and that happened in the middle of the summer of 1812 when that was formed. But the rest of the militia, the way the militia systems work, unlike back home for you, where there was actually a draft system set up where you could be drafted into the militia in England. Here in Upper Canada, it's not really a draft. It's just if you are a healthy able-bodied male of fighting age, which is between 16 and 60, you are in the militia, period. And normally in